For more than 100 years now, both Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts have sat around roaring log fires at night and carried on the rich tradition of telling campfire tales. For the most part, these stories have detailed the murderous exploits of all kinds of boogeymen, monsters, and cryptids. Yet some touch on another oft-told urban legend, that of the deranged psycho killer, the escaped asylum patient, hell-bent on the meaningless slaughter of innocents. However, as terrifying as these stories may be, we still use them for entertainment purely on the premise that they're completely fictional, that the monsters we're so afraid of can't really hurt us. There aren't any real psychopathic killers out there in the woods, are there? But maybe it'd be best to hear the story of the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders before we make any definitive judgment on that. Nestled into Mayes County, Oklahoma, Camp Scott used to be one of the Sooner State's premier Girl Scout camps. It's also one of the oldest, with the year 1977 being the 50th anniversary of its founding. Camp Scott also happens to be located on 410 acres of the most beautiful land in the entire country, with the surrounding area comprised of gently sloping hills, Tolkien-esque forests, and a tranquil freshwater creek. Interspersed in the area are a series of platform tent clusters which host any visitors. For those who were never scouts as kids, a platform tent is a large canvas tent pitched semi-permanently on a raised wooden platform, sometimes with a tin roof or tarp on top. It can usually sleep 4 to 6 people and has zippers on both sides of the tent to close the inner flap, with ties to close the outer and side flaps. There is no way to 100% close the tent in a secure way, but it is generally sturdier of an option than tent camping on the ground, and platform tents are somewhere between a cabin and a tent in terms of comfort. Like many Girl Scout camps, the tents at Camp Scott were arranged in small campsites scattered throughout the camp, each with fire pits and related amenities, with each named after a Native American tribe. You could be forgiven for thinking the camp was an outdoor paradise, a serene, wholesome slice of Eden, brimming with innocence, far from the hustle and bustle of the big city. But just a short while before the camp season of 1977, a training session was held in which veteran camp counselors would coach the incoming counselors in training on what would be expected of them. One of these counselors picked up a box of donuts on the way over, finding that a sweet treat made for a great conversation starter among the new arrivals and generally made them feel more welcomed. She shared a few of the donuts among her fellow counselors, but left the remaining donuts back near the counselor campground when she took the new arrivals on a tour of the area. When she returned, the donuts were gone, and in their place was a filthy handwritten note that bore just 3 scrawled words: 3 will die. The girl immediately showed the note to one of the camp's head of operations, but instead of taking the threat seriously, they dismissed the note as nothing but a tasteless prank and instructed the counselors to go about their business as usual. On the first day of camp season, Girl Scouts from all 4 corners of Oklahoma were bussed into Camp Scott to begin the first of many week-long visits. The mood was generally high among the young women, as school had recently finished and that summer break elation was still very much at its peak. But that Sunday, June 12th, was hardly an ideal summer's day. Thick fogs and misty rains had turned the camp into a complete soaked mess. Yet the Girl Scouts' spirits weren't dampened, and they remained positive as they were split into groups and shown to their respective campgrounds. Thankfully, the weather relented enough for the girls to partake in a few camp activities before sundown. But as night fell, the rain resumed with a vengeance, and what had previously been a light smattering of drizzle turned into a full-on downpour. To keep from being soaked, the Girl Scouts rushed back to their platform tents to bed down early, confident that the weather would improve so they could return to their wholesome outdoor fun. The following morning, one of the counselors collected her wash kit and headed over to the camp's shower block. This shower block just so happened to be right at the rear of the camp near a collection of platform tents known as Kiowa. And thanks to the horseshoe arrangement of the platforms, one of them was ever so slightly obscured from view by the shower block itself. So at around 6 a.m. on the 13th of June, this counselor headed down the hillside to the trail which led to the bathhouse. But as she approached, she spotted 3 apparently occupied bags just lying there on the trail, sleeping bags that had been piled up against each other in a disturbingly unnatural way. There was no way there would be Girl Scouts in there. There was no way anyone could sleep like that. No one living, anyway. Because when the young counselor unzipped the sleeping bags to peek at what was inside, the entire camp was awoken by a blood-curdling scream. Inside the sleeping bags were 8-year-old Lori Lee Farmer, 9-year-old Michelle Heather Goose, and 10-year-old Doris Denise Miller. Each had their skulls bashed in by a large blunt object, with at least 2 of them showing signs of heavy strangulation. The camp was immediately evacuated while one of the camp's directors contacted the local police force. Sniffer dogs were brought in to search for clues, and a single unknown fingerprint was taken from one of the girls' flashlights, and a bloody sized 9.5 footprint was found in the tent the girls were missing from. Shortly after the camp was closed off as a crime scene, police interviewed a nearby homeowner who reportedly heard something rather heavy on the small road running between the camp and his property at around 3 a.m. on the morning of the 13th. Since all the counselors had solid alibis for the determined times of death, it was deduced that this must have been the killer moving to and from the area. After a large-scale manhunt was launched to flush out the murderer, local and federal law enforcement honed in on a man named Gene Leroy Hart. Hart already had multiple convictions for indecent assault, attempted murder, burglary, and escaping federal custody. And although he lived out near Tulsa at the time of the murders, it turned out that he grew up in a house less than a mile away from Camp Scott. It also turned out that Gene Leroy Hart was of Native American heritage, Cherokee to be exact, so police began to canvass the local charity community in hopes that they could assist them in tracking Hart down. Despite being somewhat distrustful of the visiting police officers, it said that once the local Cherokee learned that Hart was wanted in connection with the murder of 3 little girls, they fell over themselves to aid in the investigation. Eventually, a Cherokee man contacted the police by telephone, informing them of a rumor that Hart was sheltering in the isolated traditional home of a well-known medicine man. And although the place proved difficult to find, police found the tip to be a good one. Hart was arrested there and then, with the medicine man insisting he had no idea Hart was accused of such a heinous crime. According to him, Hart had merely confessed to doing something terrible, although he wouldn't specify exactly what it was. At his trial for the girls' murders, the local sheriff claimed that he was 1,000% sure that Hart was the guilty party. Yet despite the man's blind certainty, there was a number of holes in the prosecution's argument that were too significant to discount. The most pertinent being that Hart didn't wear a 9.5 size shoe, meaning it couldn't have been him that stepped in the girl's blood back at Camp Scott. The prosecution argued that a man could easily wear a size too small or too large, and that the defense's argument was a flimsy one. However, when all the evidence was taken into consideration, the jury simply couldn't find Hart guilty beyond all reasonable doubt. Hart had a violent past, that much is clear, but to scapegoat him purely to sate rabid public demands for justice would be hideously unfair. Of course, there was a chance he was guilty. There was plenty of circumstantial evidence, but a man should only be locked in a cage for the rest of his life if the jury are, as the sheriff so clumsily put it, 1,000% certain. To their credit, the jury found Hart not guilty of the murders, and he walked away a free man. Yet this freedom was short-lived. After later violating his parole conditions, Hart was sent back to prison to finish his original 308-year prison sentence. You heard that right. The crimes that Hart had previously been convicted of were so utterly atrocious and prolific that a judge had seen fit to sentence him to more than 300 years in a federal penitentiary. He died of a heart attack in the prison exercise yard just 2 years later. But on the advent of DNA testing, police had the means to close the book on the Oklahoma Girl Scout murderers once and for all. When test results came back, police were stunned to discover that the chances of Hart being the girl's killer was almost 1 in 8,000. The victims' families have since demanded that more modern equipment be used in the hopes of getting more accurate readings, but law enforcement have insisted that the chances of an alternate result coming back are slim to none. As for the site of the murders, Camp Scott was never reopened to the public, becoming far too associated with a horrifying unsolved tragedy in which 3 young girls needlessly lost their lives. And without anyone convicted, there was no way anyone was going to send their kids to Camp Scott while the killer still stalked the area. These days, there's little left but forest where the camp once stood. Nothing to remind anyone of the 3 little girls who only ever wanted to have a fun summer at camp, but never returned home.
I was around 11 or 13 at the time. I would always love to go into the woods to just have some fun with my cousins, but sometimes I would stay in my backyard. Sometime in the middle of June that year, something happened that would change the way that I saw those woods. I was attempting to stay the night in my treehouse. It must have been only a few hours until dawn at the time. The treehouse is located at the edge of the woods, and I was alone at the time, or so I thought. I climbed into the treehouse and looked out the window. It was then that I realized I was pretty thirsty, so I decided to go down and walk towards my house. Around that time, I got this feeling that someone or something was watching me. I ignored it and thought it was at most some wild animal. I made it into my house and grabbed my bottle, which had some Myuu in it, which was my favorite drink as a child. As I exited the house, I noticed that our old blonde lab had followed me. He was a good dog. I gave him a quick pet, then went on my way to the treehouse. As I entered the treehouse, I looked out the window, glancing back in the direction of my dog. I noticed that he was no longer watching me. He was instead staring into one particular part of the woods. I'd never seen my dog do that before. If there was something that piqued his interest, he would go check it out. I'd never seen him just stay still like that, as if he was scared. But then he began to make this low, deep growl. I called out to him, "Rocky, what do you see, boy?" He turned to look up at me, but only for a split second, then went right back to staring at that spot in the woods. It started to rain and thunder, but along with those sounds came another, a sort of humming that was coming from my right. Immediately, I felt scared, chilled to the bone. I looked out the window that was facing the direction of that sound. I saw it, something that horrified me, that didn't make sense. A creature that I'd never seen or heard of before. It was standing at the forest floor and was a little too close to the treehouse. It was big, skinny, brown. It was looking up at my treehouse with reddish-brown eyes. I thought to myself, do I run to the house, or do I stay up here? I crouched beneath the window so that it could not see me, and I decided to stay until morning. The next day, I hurried down the treehouse and began to run as fast as I could out of the woods. After that incident, I didn't want to go into the woods ever again, because whatever that thing was could still be lurking out there, waiting for its next meal.
Firstly, I'd like to begin with a little bit of background to explain why this particular case is so personal to me. For the past 6 years, I've worked as a college campus police officer. We're a branch of law enforcement that doesn't get very much publicity or attention from the general public, but we're just as much law enforcement as any other branch. Policing college campuses is pretty much all I've ever known, too, because before I trained to be a regular cop, I worked as a campus security officer, which, trust me, was considerably easier than doing any actual police work. But it was also considerably more boring, too. If I'm being honest, I thought it would consist of breaking up crazy parties, rescuing hot sorority girls from whatever jam they'd gotten themselves into, maybe even getting a few compliments that are usually directed at a guy in uniform, but nope. All my job consisted of was walking around campus for like 8 hours a day, just making sure buildings were secure and that the right doors were locked. On top of that, I had very little training and basically no means of defending myself whatsoever. I was constantly worrying about what I'd do if I'd actually ran into any serious criminal activity, but luckily I never did. But I can't say the same for some other campus security guards, and that's pretty much the whole reason I'm writing this up. Okay, so Virginia Wesleyan University is a small Methodist college in Norfolk, Virginia, with a total population of less than 1,500 students, and back in 2006, it was even smaller than it is now. It's located near Virginia Beach in the Hampton Roads area of the state, which actually has a relatively high crime rate, but the college itself is pretty safe, and historically there's been very little in the way of trouble there. It's kind of like a little green island of bliss in the middle of an urban concrete sea, and the students that attend it rarely say anything bad about it except around exam times. Back in 2006, it didn't have anything resembling a campus police force. Now, almost all American colleges have an attachment of uniformed police to keep them safe, but back then, Wesleyan only employed a small number of unarmed security officials to keep the peace, and one of these was a guy named Walter Zakshevsky, known as Wally or Officer Wally among his colleagues in the student body. Wally was actually from Chicago to begin with, but after joining the U.S. Navy and spending a good chunk of his military career down in Norfolk, it became kind of a home away from home. I know his wife is from the area and the pair moved back to Chicago after he got out of the military, but at 57, when Wally got laid off from a steel industry job in the Windy City and got sick to death of the weather, the couple moved back down to Virginia and Wally took up a job as a campus security officer at Wesleyan University. Wally has absolutely no experience in security or law enforcement, but I'm guessing the college didn't mind that since he was ex-military and was therefore seen as being disciplined and reliable. He started in July of 2006, and what followed was basically 3 months of on-the-job training in which Wally came to love his new job. His only real complaint was how hot and humid the campus could be in the summer months, but he grew to love the student population, who viewed him as a kind of warm, friendly guardian-type figure, someone they could trust and rely on in their time of need. Then, on October 11th of that same year, Wally was getting ready for his evening shift patrolling the campus. He was wearing his regular uniform consisting of a blue dress shirt, black pants, and a duty belt containing the usual security-type tools and gadgets, handcuffs, baton, flashlight, radio, but most certainly no firearm. Many of the other security staff at the college carried pepper spray, but Wally wasn't authorized to carry any because of how new on the job he was. It had recently been his and his wife's 34th wedding anniversary, so the pair were particularly in love around that time, so he made sure to give her hugs and kisses before he headed off to work that evening. According to the records from that night, everything seemed pretty uneventful. It was just a regular shift on the sleepy college campus. Just before 10 p.m., Wally apparently made a radio call to the campus security headquarters, informing them that he was about to undertake a routine building check. Security staff regularly checked in with headquarters so that clerks working there could make notes on their movements and activities, but after that call, Wally didn't check in again. This was undoubtedly unusual. It certainly wasn't like Wally to miss a radio check, so officials back at headquarters assumed that there had been some kind of radio malfunction, such as a loss of signal. This was their final conclusion, too. Not that something bad might have happened, so no police were called, and no other members of the security team were sent to check anything out. Wally's evening shift was due to end at 11 p.m., and he usually arrived back at headquarters for a debrief shortly before his shift was due to end so he could properly hand over to the next guy on duty. But that night, Wally never arrived back at headquarters. Almost a half hour went by and there was still no signs of Wally, and it still proved impossible to get in touch with him via the radio network. Naturally, his colleagues began to worry, and a handful of security officers took off around campus to try and find him. One of these officers was the shift commander, a guy called Vic Dorsey. Dorsey was checking out the Boy Dining Center at around 11:30 p.m. when a grisly sight greeted him near the entrance. Wally was unconscious, lying in a pool of his own blood, having received multiple stab wounds around his arms and torso. Someone had evidently violently attacked him, and while Wally seemed to have attempted to pull out his baton to defend himself, he simply didn't stand a chance. Head of campus security said that when he got the call shortly after Dorsey had found Wally's body, all he needed to hear was the man's tone of voice to know the worst had occurred. Dorsey only managed to get out one word out before he burst into tears. Wally. Virginia Beach police were called in, who immediately took over the investigation into Wally's murder. One of the first things they did was to confiscate knives from anyone on campus who happened to be carrying on for whatever reason. Even the head of campus security was considered a suspect for the time being, and was made to hand over the small utility knife he kept on his keyring, despite the fact that he wasn't actually present on campus at the time of the murder. Virginia Beach Police Department also demanded that every member of the security team, as well as all other employees on campus, get down to the local department for interviews and polygraph tests. Every single member of the security team seemed only too keen to cooperate with the investigation, all except one, who apparently turned down the polygraph tests out of medical and religious reasons. As a result of lack of witnesses, clues, and CCTV footage, the investigation came up short pretty soon after it was opened up. But I'm hoping my own little analysis will be able to jog someone's memory or convince someone to come forward. Someone must know something. Someone must have seen something. Heck, even if it's the person that actually killed Wally, they should just man up, do the right thing, and admit what they did so we can all get a little closure. I mean, I did Wally's job, and that legit could have been me out there that night, stabbed to death securing a building from someone that just shouldn't have been there, and that thought alone is enough to give me chills. Personally, I have one main theory that I think explains what happened to Wally that night. Given that the encounter was outside of the dining center where students spend a fair amount of cash on their lunches and other sweet treats, a thief may have believed that there might well have been a great deal of cash left in the building overnight. He probably saw Wally, recognized the uniform, then attacked in the knowledge that Wally probably wouldn't be carrying any kind of firearm. The college itself might have been considered an easy target for any kind of serious criminal who might have known that there was very little in the way of security presence there. Yet there was absolutely no sign of any kind of break-in or an attempt at forced entry, nor had the college been the target of any organized burglaries before that time. This has given rise to other theories that some kind of grudge or dispute between coworkers led to Wally's death. After all, there was one member of the security team that refused to take a polygraph test, and if you ask me, that's probably the most suspicious thing about this entire case. It's also really curious that there was no CCTV footage of the attack. Another member of the security team would have known where the cameras were at, and therefore where the best place to attack Wally would be. Yet Wally was a very popular member of the team, so what could he have done to incur someone's anger in such a way is almost totally beyond me. In the words of Marianne Zarchevsky, Wally's widow, I just want to ask them why. Why didn't you just leave? Why did you have to hurt him? And perhaps the most tragic thing I've learned about the events surrounding Wally's death is that just a few months before he was murdered, the head of campus security had been asking the college to pony up the cash to hire some actual trained, armed police officers. Leo Tarian, head of security, has pretty much openly admitted that it was hideously unfair to put untrained and unprepared people in a situation that might lead to encounters with armed and violent criminals. But he also puts it out there that the college was vehemently against the hiring of armed off-duty officers, on the grounds that it would create a negative atmosphere on campus by frightening the students. After Wally's death, Wesleyan College not only hired an off-duty officer but offered a $25,000 reward out of their own pocket for any information leading to the identification and arrest of Officer Wally's killer. A shadow box containing a photo of Wally, his now retired badge, and a medal now hangs in the Wesleyan security office, with the box bearing the inscription, "For the ultimate sacrifice." But as sad and tragic as the whole thing is, it pales in comparison to the terrifying idea that a man could be killed in such a brutal fashion while at work, with one of his own colleagues as perhaps the main suspect, and that still, to this day, not a single person has been charged or convicted over his murder. We can only hope that Wally and his widow managed to find some measure of peace.